Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Transportation Alternatives Program. My name is Travis Hooley and I work with the Local Programs and Finance section here at WisDOT as the Transportation Alternatives and Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program Manager. Today, I will be providing you with an overview of our newest program solicitation that will supplement federal fiscal years 2022 and 2023 for available funding in the TAP program. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, in the YouTube video description, there should be a link to our email inbox. That is dotlocalprograms@dot.wi.gov. Additionally, my contact information as well as others' contact information will be listed later on in today's webinar. At this time, I would like to welcome Abby Sweats to say a few words. Abby joins us on behalf of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction and is the Communications Director. As a former middle school teacher, Abby has been recognized for her work with inclusive curriculum as the 2017 GSAFE Educator of the Year, as well as her work as a cooperating teacher with the Rockwell Cooperating Teachers Award through UW-Madison. She's a recent graduate of the La Folla School of Public Affairs, where she focused on policy affecting marginalized communities and where she was presented with the Penniman Prize for Best Policy Paper at her graduation. Before coming to DPI, Abby was a communications specialist with the Office of the Secretary in the Department of Health Services, where she served as the department's speechwriter and lead communicator about the biennial budget. Take it away, Abby.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Travis, for that kind introduction. It is a very odd experience to hear your own bio read back to you. As Travis just explained, I am the Communications Director here at the Department of Public Instruction, and I am here as our messenger to convey how excited we were to hear from WisDOT about this collaborative effort to reach out to school districts about this opportunity that you will learn more about today. And I see the outreach is working because I hear quite a few of you have joined us on the YouTube live stream. I won't take up too much of this time on the webinar, but I want to encourage districts to participate in the Transportation Alternatives Program. I know we will all learn a lot today, and I'm looking forward to learning more alongside you. As a firm believer that public schools are themselves infrastructure and that data-driven instruction is the most effective kind of teaching, I am especially excited to learn more about both the infrastructure and non-infrastructure planning project possibilities. Thank you again for being here, and I will turn it back over to our partners at WisDOT now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Abby. Now, to keep things rolling, I'll just briefly point out our webinar outline. Today, we'll be going over what is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We'll also talk about the WisDOT action plan with respect to the Transportation Alternatives Program. We'll then jump right into defining what the Transportation Alternatives Program is, and specifically what we're looking for in this solicitation effort. Following that overview, we'll talk more so about how to apply, and we'll go over the TAP application and a few key fields that we will expect applicants to complete. And later on, we'll spend a brief amount of time looking at our additional resources, including contact information and other useful links that you might consider accessing. Just as a quick heads up with respect to the presentation materials today, before submitting any questions about accessing these materials, this slide deck will be made available following today's presentation on our WisDOT TAP webpage, which we will be visiting in these slides today. So let's begin by addressing this question. What is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law? Well, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was signed back in November of 2021, and it represents a significant increase of federal funding available to local programs over the next 5 federal fiscal years. Many of you may be familiar with the FAST Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is here to replace it and enhance the programming under the FAST Act. The programs that are included within the local programs and finance section that have been impacted include the Surface Transportation Program, also known as STP, the Local Bridge Improvement Assistance Program, the Transportation Alternatives Program, which of course we are here to discuss in greater detail today, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, as well as the new Carbon Reduction Program. Now, before we talk about financial impacts as related to the bill, we wanted to start with this overview of our current action plan. And again, this is a high-level overview. I'll spend a little bit of time here, but we'll get more into the in-depth overview of these key details throughout today's presentation. Now, when the bipartisan infrastructure law was announced, we were in the midst of our what we will call a traditional program solicitation. Historically, WisDOT has always operated our transportation alternatives program on a 4-year program cycle that overlaps with the last cycle by 2 years and the next cycle by 2 years. So just to paint a picture of that verbally, our latest or our last solicitation prior to this one was the 2020-24 solicitation, and now during the announcement of the bill, we were currently under deliberation for the 22-26 solicitation. Now, many of you may have applied to that cycle, and the important thing to note for those of you who may have applied for funding in that solicitation is that those projects or those program applications are still under consideration. Generally speaking, in the Transportation Alternatives Program, we tend to always see more project requests than we have funding. But in light of the bill, we realized through analysis that there was going to be a need for additional projects that could meet a federal fiscal year 22 schedule. So as such, WisDOT determined that it would be best to roll out a supplemental solicitation, what we are calling the BIL supplemental FFY2022-2023 solicitation, and focusing that solicitation on non-infrastructure projects. I'll get more into the details of why we chose to how we chose this process. But at a high level, it's important to note that with respect to non-infrastructure projects, these are types of projects that are very easy to schedule, authorize, and ultimately deliver with respect to the entire program. So these are the types of projects that we are looking for. They include safe routes to school programming projects, as well as non-infrastructure planning studies. Those could include both safe routes to school planning studies, as well as general bicycle pedestrian safety planning studies. Additionally, looking towards the future here, I will go over our timelines for the solicitation later on in today's webinar, but as soon as we have a clear picture of what the traditional and supplemental solicitations outcomes are, we intend to make award recommendations in mid to late June. All of this with a goal to obligate as much of the federal fiscal 22 funding that's been made available to us as possible. The key distinction with federal funds as opposed to state funds is that these funds do not roll over into the next fiscal year. So we're in a situation where we either need to use the funding or we will lose access to it. Both the traditional and the supplemental solicitation will be included in that release. We'll be providing more information through releases of future webinars, as well as other information through our web pages. And we're here to help if you do have any questions as you prepare for this new solicitation, or if you have questions about a previous program submission. Again, our central office staff and regional staff are here to help, and our email is depicted on screen, dot.localprograms@dot.wi.gov. Before we go too much farther, it's important to understand that as a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, WisDOT has pivoted in the short term our thought process around our scheduling deadlines. Many of you as school staff or administrators are likely very familiar with how the state fiscal year operates from July 1st to June 30th. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have until September 30th of 2022, which is the last day of federal fiscal year in this current year, to obligate these project funds. And what we mean by obligate is to formally assign federal funding to a project. I'll go into a bit more detail later on what that looks like from the local side, but it's important to note on this slide that we have until September 30th, which is not a lot of time, of course, but under our timelines, we are confident that we will be able to identify projects and get them obligated before that deadline. Now, I have this slide up here to sort of provide you with a high-level overview of what exactly we're talking about in terms of timeline, looking at the next few months. Over the course of this summer, we need to identify as many of these projects as possible that we can fit into the schedule for either federal fiscal years 22 or 23, assuming that we have ample projects to fit that gap. We intend to work with our project awardees as soon as possible. Once we've identified the project awards and had award letters signed by the governor's office, WisDOT will be in direct communication with all of our project sponsors to ensure that we are able to encumber the funds. And encumber and obligate are sort of synonymous in this example. To encumber funds, we need to do things like having the state municipal agreement, which is our contract with between the state and the local, signed by both parties. We need to create project records in our tracking systems, and we need to formally request funding authorization. All of this will be gone over in much greater detail with those of you who do apply and are successful in achieving or in receiving an award in this cycle. But from that point, once projects have been authorized, you will be eligible to begin your project and begin activities that would be requested for reimbursement. WisDOT, the TAP program at WisDOT is a reimbursement program. I'll go over that here in a bit more detail on our next slide. But it's important to note that sponsors of TAP projects are responsible for the upfront costs of your project and subsequently request reimbursement through the state. So now we're going to take a deep dive at the TAP program. We're going to look at what is unique to this program and how it has been modified with respect to this solicitation. Now, the Transportation Alternatives Program is a federally funded reimbursement program with, generally speaking, an 80-20% cost share. That means that the 80% of your project costs are reimbursable through federal reimbursement. However, like I just said on one of our previous slides, project sponsors are required to pay the 100% upfront costs of their project and then subsequently request reimbursement. The Transportation Alternatives Program places particular emphasis on projects that generate or enhance utilitarian non-motorized trips. I put emphasis on both utilitarian as well as non-motorized, being that those are two of the areas where we tend to get a lot of questions and concerns. For the purposes of this solicitation, given the fact that we are targeting specifically non-infrastructure projects, this isn't so much of a concern. But if you do have questions about what we mean by utilitarian versus recreational and non-motorized, you can please feel free to submit us your questions. But again, for this solicitation, we're looking specifically at non-infrastructure projects. Those include planning studies or safe routes to school programming activities versus our traditional solicitations, which would have a variety of different activities such as, trail design, construction, railroad coordination, and utility work. The list goes on. We are very specifically limiting the solicitation to activities that we have deemed as achievable and feasible in our very limited time frame. Eligible entities in the TAP program include a variety of different entities. On the list here are just a few examples. They include local units of government, transit agencies, tribal governments, school districts, nonprofits, and many others. We have a full list available on the application materials themselves. There will be a picture of that later on today, so we can take a look at that, and I'll point that out when we get to it. Now, let's begin looking at the solicitations themselves. We'll start by looking at what I call the quote-unquote traditional solicitation. The 2022-26 program cycle closed for application submission on January 28th of 2022. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, not only do we have an increase in the federal funding limit, an increase of approximately 150% over our FAST Act funding levels, we also have changes in project selection requirements. And at WisDOT, we needed to take time to understand those requirements as we moved through an existing program solicitation in order to ensure that we were maintaining compliance with federal standards. That being said, at the time when we realized that the bill was going to impact the Transportation Alternatives Program, we offered those applicants who had already submitted for the traditional cycle the opportunity to review their materials that they had submitted and consider reevaluating their costs and scope of their projects. The reality here is that when we're looking at the changes in funding availability, they are significant. Like I said, approximately 150% increases over our original FAST Act values, and we'll get into those here in just a moment. Now looking at the federal fiscal year supplemental solicitation, the solicitation that is active and that we invite you to consider applying to today, Again, we are really focusing in on safe routes to school programming projects and planning study projects. I'll go over the sort of the differences between these two types of projects when we go through the application materials, but generally speaking, safe routes to school programming projects include activities such as educating students or encouraging students to bike and walk to school, or tracking student travel patterns. Planning studies much more so focus on identifying needs in key areas, and could lead to things such as infrastructure improvements in the future. However, unfortunately, given our limited time frame, we have to limit these types of exploratory planning study projects to merely planning studies, and cannot include anything such as a preliminary engineering tasks, design work, or any acquisition of property. Our goal here with the solicitation is to try and fill as much of our available funding in federal fiscal years 22 and 23 as possible. However, we won't know exactly what those figures are until we have begun our evaluation process. Again, we have to evaluate these based on population groups, and ultimately the projects that are selected for funding are selected by a competitive committee. I'll also touch on that here in a little bit, just describing a bit more about the committee. But for the sake of time, we'll continue to move on. Looking at upcoming events, we have considered the release of supplemental solicitations beyond this current supplement. However, there's nothing official at this time with respect to when a supplemental solicitation for either TAP or our other programs might be announced. So please stay tuned to our BIL web pages as well as our TAP web page, and to your emails. Of course, we will continue to work with DPI to ensure that we're communicating as effectively as possible to our school district partners and other partners around the state, to ensure that we advertise these programs as much as possible. Eventually, our goal here at WisDOT is to return to a more traditional, quote unquote, program cycle structure, where we have 4 years of program funding, and amongst that 4 years of funding, 2 of those years of funding are new years of funding. So ideally, the earliest that could happen at this point would likely be 2024, meaning a 2024 to 28 cycle. But again, this is our goal. This is not something that we have plans at this point in time of achieving. More information, again, will continue to come out about this, as well as any supplemental solicitations where they are necessary. Now, looking more deeply at the 22 to 23 solicitation, we formally announced and provided application materials for this effort on May 6th. And again, focusing on very specific project activities that fall under the non-infrastructure category. These applications are due by close of business on June 3rd. Some of you may work later than others. As long as we receive the applications by the end of the day on June 3rd, we will accept them. Once those applications have been received and we have a better understanding of how many applications we have overall, WisDOT, as well, or along with our partners, amongst the selection committee members, will go through and evaluate these applications through an objective scoring process. This committee does include members from a variety of different public and nonprofit entities. They include folks such as our WisDOT central office and regional program managers, the Bureau of Highway Safety, or of Transportation Safety, and with the Division of State Patrol, Wisconsin DNR, of course, the Department of Public Instruction, the Department of Tourism, the counties, Wisconsin Counties Association. The list goes on, and even includes the legislators. We are still finalizing the committee members for this current solicitation, but once those committee members meet, all TAP projects will be selected and announced by July. Successful sponsors will receive a formal notification signed by either the secretary or the governor. And once that occurs, we will initiate the discussions around generating our contract agreements and establishing project records. And now here, I'll spend quite a bit of time looking at our funding amounts, looking more specifically at the limits. On screen, we have the 4 geographic population areas that we need to keep in mind as per the federal guidance that we've received under the bill. Historically, the TAP program has operated with two separate funding buckets, one specific to the TAP greater than 200,000, those areas we call our transportation management areas, they are the largest MPOs in the state, and we have 6 of them, and additionally a statewide pool. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have very specific and clear instructions to delineate funding by geographic population areas within that statewide classification. So now we must separate and award projects for areas less than 5,000, 5 to 50,000, and 50 to 200,000 respectively. As you can see, we have percentage breakdowns on the table on the top for specifically federal fiscal 22 funding, totaling 17.5 million. Again, this is approximately 150% increase to the annual budget in the TAP program. Traditionally, as some of you may be aware, we approximately have a balance of annually of $7 million under the FAST Act. So this is a huge and very significant increase to our funding availability. The table on the bottom includes both the set-aside estimates as well as what's currently scheduled. And again, just as a reminder, due to the nature of how WisDOT has traditionally managed the TAP program, you'll notice that the 5 to 50,000 category is currently showing as a negative value, and that's simply given the fact that we've received an overabundance of applications in this category, and per our previous guidance, we were fully within compliance to award projects in such a manner. We are going to honor the structure that the bipartisan infrastructure law has established moving forward, so that we make sure that we're delineating funding across these geographic population areas to ensure that our methodology is consistent with federal expectations. I realize that because that number is appearing as negative, that may appear as a deterrent, but I want to strongly encourage any of you school district representatives or local public agencies out there who fall within that category. We still strongly encourage you to apply because for several reasons. Projects do tend to change schedules very last minute in the TAP program, and we try to make sure that we have projects available to fill that gap where possible. Additionally, this is only showing federal fiscal year 22, and this solicitation includes the option of funding in 2023. So regardless of whether you select federal fiscal 22 or 23 on your application, depending on where we have funding availability, you might be contacted by WisDOT with a request to consider moving your project funding from one of those years to the other. Next, we'll take a look at where to find the transportation alternatives application materials, and I'll go over both how to access them and a few key screens from the materials themselves. So starting from the wisconsindot.gov webpage, some of you may have issues with firewalls when accessing this page. If you do have difficulties, I would suggest just using your preferred browser or search engine and searching for Wisconsin DOT or WisDOT. And you should come to a page that looks something familiar to what's on screen now. And in the search box where it says search Wisconsin DOT, you would type in the phrase TAP, all one word, and the first result would take you to the Transportation Alternatives Program page. Alternatively, you could go ahead and just search WisDOT TAP in your preferred search engine. We just strongly encourage that you do your searching through our page to ensure that there's no issues with accessing the incorrect location. And on our Transportation Alternatives Program page, you'll see a brief descriptor of the Transportation Alternatives Program, as well as a bipartisan infrastructure law update and the solicitation materials for this current supplemental solicitation. On screen next to the big blue arrow, you see the new tag where those materials can be found. And the available materials include an application as well as instructions. Now we're going to take a look at the application materials themselves and look at a few key pages of the application. First things first, for those of you who have applied to the TAP program in the past, these materials may look familiar, but there are some key distinctions that make them different. So it's important to notice these and act accordingly when filling them out. On the very top on the left page, you'll see that there are two check boxes, one for either seeking programming projects and safe routes to school, or planning studies, including safe routes to school planning studies. You'll want to select one or the other of these boxes. And on the right side of the page, you'll notice that we have a repetition of these in the project activity category. It's important that these align. If you do feel that your project proposal includes elements of both of these types of activities or neither, but you still feel that your project activity would fit within the non-infrastructure eligibility, please go ahead and contact us right away, and we will try and have a conversation with you and provide you with a best practices to move on how to move forward. Additionally, we try to be very clear in these documents that this is a non-infrastructure solicitation. We have the geographic population areas called out right off the bat in the project applicant type section. It's very important that you fill that out appropriately. If you do have questions about that as well, our recommendation to you would be to list the wherever your primary administration building is located. For the time being, use that facility, but please be sure in your application materials to adequately describe school demographics. We'll go over that on the next couple of pages of the slides in a bit greater detail. But for the time being, only select one of these fields. Additionally, on the bottom right, we have project summary. We ask you to limit this to 400 words or less. You can either submit this as a separate Word document or write into the field, but we essentially just want to hear from you what the high-level key notes and key takeaways from your project proposal are. The next couple of pages include things such as project benefit. I'll talk more about project benefit when we get to the narrative section, but it's important to note that we have several different types of benefits that you might consider including as key areas. Project benefit is one of our criteria for review for selection of projects, so it's important to make sure that not only are you selecting the boxes to make it or to describe your project accurately, but also that in your narrative you adequately describe the project and that benefit itself. We also ask for local resolutions of support for the purpose of non-infrastructure projects. Essentially, all this document would be is a certification from your local public agency or from your school board, indicating that you or that your agency is willing to accept the financial commitments that are being placed upon you should you receive an award. Additionally, we ask for things such as facility information, specifically if your schools or other areas are within specific distances from highway facilities or other high-risk areas for non-motorized traffic. For schools and safe routes to school programming projects, we also ask for school demographic information directly in this document. Additionally, you are more than welcome to submit this as a separate document if you maintain demographic data in an Excel spreadsheet. However, it's easiest to provide that information to us, we will accept. Next, we get into more of the confidential section of the applications where we go over financial estimates for your project. Again, when you're submitting this information, we understand that for some of you who may not have run a Safe Routes to School program project before, it may be difficult to come up with a solid, clear estimate for what your project will be. Again, these are estimates that we ask for in terms of what you want to do, and to assist you in determining those project estimates, we've come up with a few different Safe Routes to School programming package options, essentially to try and encourage you to consider, based on the perceptions of your needs at this time, whether it be an educational focus, a safety concern related to specific facility or specific high-risk areas, or outreach and communication with students. We've built a few different examples of how you can delineate funding across the different buckets. And speaking of the buckets, I would be remiss if I did not mention the 4 criteria that we are classifying as non-infrastructure or classifications for Safe Routes programs. On the left, you'll see education, enforcement, encouragement, and evaluation. These are described very briefly here in this document in the application, but at a high level, they provide specific types of activities that are considered as eligible in the Safe Routes to School programming classification. There's a link at the end of this PowerPoint to the Federal Highway Administration's page on Safe Routes to School. And if you have questions about program eligibility and with specific activities under these categories, I would encourage you to visit their page. And then for planning study projects, either for standard planning studies or Safe Routes to School planning studies, similarly, we are looking for an estimate of your project cost rounded out to the nearest $1,000. Regardless of if you are submitting a planning study project or a Safe Routes to School project, please ensure that you are selecting the preferred federal fiscal year on the application, as well as entering total project cost. For the planning study applications, we're only asking for the total cost of your project, whereas for the Safe Routes to School planning projects, I'll just back up once quickly. We ask for both the federal and the local cost share requested. So please complete this table to the best of your abilities as you are preparing your application materials. The narrative response section is a key component to your application. We strongly encourage you to be as thorough as possible within the space allotted. The narrative response is limited to 3 pages of double-spaced text, 11-point font with a 1-inch margin. And these 5 questions are discussed in the application themselves with a bit more detail and suggestions of how you can describe your project built into the application itself. They include the project description and overview, which generally speaking can simply be limited to that 400-word description of your application summary or some form of abridged version of that. The project planning, preparation, and local support, project utility and connectivity, and project benefit are the criteria or are the areas where we generally see the most content with respect to describing your project, the background of how has this project come about, how have you prepared, and who is in support of the project, how will your project impact the transportation system itself, whether or even with these non-infrastructure projects, we see a lot of opportunities to create greater utility of our transportation networks, as well as creating better connections for students and other non-motorized transportation users. Project benefit, again, for any of those sections that you click the checkbox in the project or in the application itself, we will expect there to be some form of description of how that benefit will be achieved and what specifically that benefit looks like. And lastly, sponsor history. We ask that all sponsors, regardless of whether you've applied for a local program project or not, please consider, listing your experience delivering projects at the local level, and even if they never had federal or state funding on them. But if you have had those types of projects, we do encourage you to include some background on those. And on the very last page of your application, we have an application attachments checklist. This includes a full list of everything that's required upon submission. You'll notice 4 bullets down, if available, local resolutions of support for your project. We encourage you to go and speak with your speak with your school district representatives, your local public agency representatives to describe the effort and request a local resolution of support for the proposed project, but this is not a requirement for submission. The application we request in Microsoft Word format. Again, the narrative response, 3 double-spaced pages of 11-point font, a cost estimate detail spreadsheet. Generally speaking, we anticipate receiving these as an Excel document. So please consider submitting the cost estimates via Excel as an attachment to your application. For nonprofit entities only, we do historically require a resolution to be ratified by the secondary municipal agency. We're still in the process of finalizing our state level policy that guides these entities. For the time being, this documentation is not looked at as required, but we would still encourage nonprofit entities to work with school districts and other local public agencies to ensure that everyone is on the same page and coordination is occurring ahead of the project application. Additionally, for Safe Routes to School programming projects or planning study projects, we require school demographic data be submitted along with your application. Again, that can either be included on page A7 of the application or as a separate document. If you are proposing a planning study project, we ask that you provide a description of your existing planning efforts thus far at a 400-word or less minimum, or maximum, excuse me, and 3 pages of additional attachments such as photos, additional letters of support from community members, and essentially anything that you'd like to include to describe the scope of your project and the benefit. Now, to talk about a few tips for submitting successful applications in local programs. At this point in time, it's important that you are, if you are considering applying for the TAP program, it's important to think about the needs of your community and the overall scope of what you would like to accomplish. Doing so, we are more than willing to work with our local public agencies and school districts to review the types of work that might be needed and to answer questions that you might have. We're here to provide technical assistance where possible to help you clearly define your project. And additionally, conducting stakeholder outreach by hosting meetings or sending out email blasts to parents or members of the community to try and gain support for your project. It really helps to paint a picture when you're able to provide that types of information within your application. Now that the application window is open, additionally, it's important to make sure that you complete all sections of the application. While we don't require maps or location information for non-infrastructure projects, we do still encourage you to consider submitting, graphics that help to describe the scope of your project. It's also beneficial to take the step of having somebody other than the preparer of your application review the materials to ensure there are no errors, especially when looking at things like the application cost estimate versus the cost estimate spreadsheets. It's important to not only keep all of that accurate, but to additionally engage us as the reviewers and really paint a picture and tell a story with your materials. And lastly, of course, June 3rd, 2022, by close of business is our application deadline, and we will need to have those applications in by that date. Once we've actually completed the application review, or the deadline, excuse me, it's important to be proactive, patient, and persistent as we are going through the review and selection process. These things do take time on our end, and not all applications may necessarily be successful on the first go around, but we are very pleased and appreciate your participation in today's webinar and demonstrating that you are interested in this type of activity. And not all applications are successful the first time, but we do pay close attention to those applications that come in a second or a third time. To ensure, just to make sure that we are looking at the demonstrable efforts that locals are putting in to seek these funds. Moving on, we'll just take a quick look at some additional resources. I realize we are now 15 minutes over time, and unfortunately, I don't believe we'll have too much time for questions today. Actually, unfortunately, we won't have any time looking at the clock. So quickly, here on screen are our central office staff member contact information. Myself, Travis Hooley, in the top left. Our section chief here in the local programs and finance section, Meryl Meckler-Hickson. My supervisor, Tim Alushigan, and then our BIL primary point of contact, Jason Starkey. You can feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions about transportation alternatives programming projects, and specifically with respect to this solicitation. We are more than happy to work with you. Additionally, you can go ahead and submit those questions to our DOT local programs inbox. I see that we have received approximately 7 questions. And again, my apologies, we will not have time today during the webinar to address your questions, but we will be responding via email to your questions. And we will additionally be preparing frequently asked question materials to either enhance our existing BIL FAQs or build out separate TAP specific frequently asked questions. You may also find benefit in contacting your regional program managers. On screen now is the map of the WisDOT regions. We have 5 in the state, as well as, and additionally, the local regional program managers contact information is listed on this screen. So I'll take a moment here in case you do decide you'd like to contact one of them. However, with respect to these non-infrastructure program projects, it is more than likely that you will work directly with central office upon receiving an award. So it is helpful to reach out to these people if you have project-specific questions, but when it comes to reviewing status of applications, you can feel free to contact me directly. Additionally, here we have a few additional slides or additional resources, including our home pages for the various web pages that we've talked about today, a few pages of varying guidance, both from WisDOT and FHWA, as well as a few guides and statutory references that that may prove helpful. Again, this deck will be posted to the WisDOT webpage, as well as a replay of today's webinar for your convenience. At this point in time, I'd like to say thank you so much for your participation in today's webinar. Again, my apologies for our technical difficulties, but we are thankful to have had you here today with us. Please go ahead and submit any questions you do have to the DOT local programs inbox depicted on screen, and we will do our best to address your questions as quickly as possible. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.